What happens when a man who once ruled the heights of wealth and power, where everything was measured in dollars and dominance, suddenly faces a secret he buried for 30 years? A tiny box, 2 pairs of innocent eyes, and a faded letter, fragments, that seem insignificant, but hold the power to topple an empire. Will he cling to his pride, or sacrifice it all to right a wrong he can't undo? Don't miss this journey. Hit that like button and subscribe now to uncover a story where honor and family collide in the most unexpected, heart-wrenching way. The golf course stretched out before Richard Grayson like a sea of emerald, its manicured perfection unbroken save for the occasional ripple of wind. At 62, he stood alone on the private Long Island green, the early morning sun casting his shadow long and lean across the dew-kissed grass. In his hands, the polished driver felt like an extension of himself, solid, precise, controlled. Each swing was a ritual, a testament to the discipline that had built Grayson Enterprises into a billion-dollar empire of steel and glass. The sharp crack of the ball meeting the club echoed through the stillness, a sound as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. This was his sanctuary, a place where the world's chaos couldn't reach him. Richard's life was a masterpiece of order. His Hamptons estate loomed in the distance, a sprawling monument of wealth with its oak-paneled walls and priceless art, but it was a silent kingdom. No children's laughter had ever bounced off those walls. No warm meals had filled the air. With comfort. He preferred it that way, or so he told himself. The solitude was the price of success, a necessary sacrifice for a man who had clawed his way to the top of the real estate world. He wore his tailored suits like armor, his silver hair combed back with military precision, and his eyes, sharp, unyielding, missed nothing. To the elite circles of Manhattan, he was a titan, a man whose name carried weight. But here, on the green, he was just Richard, and the wind was his only companion. 30 years ago, he'd made a choice. His daughter Emily had been 18, bright-eyed and defiant when she'd come to him with news that shattered his carefully constructed world. She was leaving, abandoning the Ivy League path he'd laid out for her, to marry a penniless musician with a beat-up guitar and dreams too big for his britches. Richard could still hear his own voice, cold and final. "If you choose him, don't call me your father." She'd walked out, her footsteps fading down the marble hall of their old home, and he'd let her go. It was for her own good. He'd reasoned, and for the Grayson name. Honor demanded it. He hadn't seen her since, hadn't wanted to. The memory stung like a splinter lodged too deep to pull out, but he buried it beneath layers of work, wealth, and willful forgetting. Now, as he lined up his next shot, the wind shifted, carrying a faint rustle that wasn't part of the morning's rhythm. He paused, club raised, and turned. 2 small figures emerged from the tree line at the edge of the green, a boy, maybe 10, with sharp, searching eyes, and a girl, younger, clutching a tattered doll to her chest. Their clothes were worn, their shoes scuffed, a stark contrast to the pristine elegance of this place. Richard's brow furrowed. Trespassers? Kids from some nearby town, no doubt, lost or looking for trouble. He lowered the club, resting it against his shoulder, and waited as they approached. The boy stopped a few feet away, planting himself with a confidence that belied his age. His dark hair fell messily over his forehead, but his gaze was steady, unflinching. "You're our grandfather," he said, his voice clear and firm, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Richard's chest tightened, but his face remained a mask of calm. "Grandfather?" The word was absurd, a punchline to a joke he hadn't heard. He straightened, towering over the boy, and let his voice drop to the low, measured tone that had silenced boardrooms. "I don't have grandchildren. You're mistaken. Now get off my property." The boy didn't flinch, didn't back down. He just stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of his too-big jacket, staring up at Richard as if he could see right through him. The girl beside him shifted closer, her wide eyes, hazel, like Emily's, peering up from behind a fringe of tangled blonde hair. Richard's grip on the golf club tightened, the wood creaking faintly under his fingers. Those eyes. They tugged at something deep, something he'd locked away decades ago. A flicker of memory. Emily at 5 laughing. As he pushed her on a swing, flashed through his mind, unbidden and unwanted. He shoved it down. "We're not mistaken," the boy said. "Mom told us about you. She said you wouldn't want to see us, but we had to come anyway." His tone wasn't pleading or angry, just matter of fact, as if he were reciting a truth too obvious to argue. Richard's jaw clenched. "Mom? Emily?" The splinter in his chest twisted, but he kept his composure, his voice steady as steel. "I don't know who your mother is, and I don't care. Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The boy reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, weathered box, barely bigger than a pack of cards, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. He held it out, his small hand unwavering. "She said this would make you remember. It's yours." Richard stared at the box, the wind picking up around them, tugging at his jacket. He didn't move to take it, didn't speak. The girl stepped forward then, her doll dangling by one arm, and looked up at him with those haunting eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice soft as a breath. "We don't have anyone else." For a moment, the world tilted. Richard's pulse thudded in his ears, but he didn't lash out, didn't raise his voice. Years of discipline held him steady, a wall against the storm brewing inside. He wanted to turn away, to walk back to his pristine life and leave these kids to whatever delusion had brought them here. But those eyes, Emily's eyes, pinned him in place. The boy's words echoed. She said this would make you remember. What could Emily have left behind that mattered now, after all these years? He stood there, the golf club heavy in his hand, the wind whistling through the silence. The green stretched out around him, vast and empty, a mirror to the life he'd built. For the first time in decades, Richard Grayson felt the weight of something he couldn't control. Not the wind, not the kids, not the past creeping back to claim him. And in that moment, he knew. This was a challenge to the honor he'd spent a lifetime defending. Richard Grayson sat behind the massive oak desk in his study, the room a fortress of wealth and solitude. The walls gleamed with polished wood, lined with shelves of leather-bound books he'd never read and awards he'd earned through decades of relentless ambition. A single lamp cast a warm golden glow over the space, softening the edges of a life built on hard lines. Outside, the wind from the golf course rattled the windows of his Hamptons estate, a faint howl that seemed to carry whispers he couldn't quite silence. On the desk before him lay the small, weathered box the boy had thrust into his world, an intruder as unwelcome as the children who'd brought it. He hadn't wanted to take it. When Jacob held it out on the green, Richard's first instinct had been to walk away, to call security and let someone else deal with the mess. But Lily's quiet pleas had stopped him, her voice threading through the cracks in his armor. So he'd taken the box, his fingers brushing the boy's cold hand for a fleeting second, and retreated here, to the one place where he could still feel in control. Now alone he stared at it. The edges were smoothed by time, the wood scratched and faded, but it carried a weight that went beyond its size. She said this would make you remember. Jacob's words gnawed at him, a challenge he couldn't dismiss. Richard's hands hesitated above the lid, steady as ever despite the tremor he felt inside. Control was his currency, control over his empire, his emotions, his life. He'd spent 30 years perfecting it, burying the memory of Emily's departure beneath boardroom victories and billion-dollar deals. She'd chosen her path, defied him, and he'd let her go to protect the Grayson name. Honor demanded it, or so he'd convinced himself. But now, with this box in front of him, that certainty wavered like a shadow in the wind. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a scrap of faded fabric, was a silver necklace, a delicate chain with a tiny star pendant, glinting faintly under the lamp's light. His breath caught, a sharp, involuntary hitch. He knew it instantly. He'd bought it for Emily's 5th birthday, picked it out himself from a jeweler in Manhattan, a rare moment of softness in a life defined by steel. She'd worn it every day, twirling the star between her fingers as she laughed, her hazel eyes bright with trust. The memory hit him like a wave, her small hand in his, the sound of her voice calling him Daddy. And for a moment, he was back there, before everything fell apart. Beneath the necklace was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. Richard unfolded it with care, his fingers precise despite the storm brewing in his chest. Emily's handwriting stared back at him, slanted and familiar, the ink smudged in places as if she'd written it in a hurry. "Dad," it began, "I don't need your money and I never did, but I wish you'd see me just once for who I am. I hope one day you'll understand what family means. I'll always love you." The words ended abruptly. No signature, no date, just a raw, unfinished plea that pierced him deeper than any accusation could. He set the note down, his hand steady, but his eyes burning. Emily, his daughter, the girl he'd pushed away because she wouldn't bend to his will. He'd told himself she'd come crawling back, that she'd see the error of her ways and beg for his forgiveness. She never had. And now, these children, Jacob and Lily, stood in her place, their presence a living echo of the past he'd tried to erase. Jacob's voice rang in his mind. "Mom told us about you." What had she said? That he was a cold, unfeeling tyrant? That he'd abandoned her? The thought stung, but he didn't let it take root. He wouldn't lose control, not now. The door creaked open, and Richard looked up, his composure snapping back into place like a shield. Jacob stood there, his small frame silhouetted against the hallway's dim light. The boy stepped inside, uninvited, his sneakers silent on the hardwood floor. "They said she's gone," he said, his voice steady but edged with something raw. "Mom, she died last year. We've been with our aunt, but she doesn't want us. She drinks too much." Richard's throat tightened, but he kept his face impassive, his hands resting calmly on the desk. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words mechanical, a reflex from years of navigating delicate situations. "But I'm not your grandfather. You've got the wrong man." Jacob's eyes narrowed, sharp and unyielding. "Mom said, you sent money sometimes, through someone else so we wouldn't know it was you. She never used it. She kept it in a jar, said it was yours to give in person if you ever came." He paused, his gaze dropping to the necklace on the desk. "She wore that every day, even when we didn't have food." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick with a truth Richard couldn't outrun. He'd sent money, anonymously through a lawyer after Emily left. A gesture, he'd told himself, to ease his conscience without admitting fault. He'd assumed she'd taken it, used it to survive her foolish choices. But she hadn't. She'd kept it. A silent rebuke waiting for him to show up. And he never had. The realization settled over him like a heavy coat. But he didn't flinch, didn't let his voice waver. "That doesn't change anything," he said, meeting Jacob's stare. "I don't know you." Jacob nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "She said you'd say that, too." He turned to leave, then stopped, looking back. "Lily's scared. She thinks no one wants us. I told her you might." Richard didn't respond. The boy walked out, leaving the door ajar, and the silence returned, heavier now. He picked up the necklace, the star cold against his palm, and closed his eyes. Emily was gone. Dead. And these children, her children, were here, carrying her memory like a torch he couldn't extinguish. He'd spent a lifetime building an empire, guarding his honor with iron resolve, but this small battered box, threatened to unravel it all. He set the necklace down, his movements deliberate, and leaned back in his chair. The wind howled. Outside, a restless echo of the past he'd buried. For the first time in years, Richard Grayson felt the edges of his control fraying, not from anger or weakness, but from something far more dangerous. The quiet, insistent pull of a family he'd turned his back on. Richard Grayson stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Manhattan office, the city sprawling beneath him like a chessboard he'd mastered long ago. The 47th floor of Grayson Enterprises was a cathedral of glass and steel, its sleek lines and muted grays a testament to his unyielding precision. Outside, The skyline glittered under a pale March sky, but inside, the air buzzed with tension. His desk was littered with newspapers and tablets, their screens ablaze with headlines. Billionaire's secret grandkids? Grayson's hidden shame, exposed. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn, reporters and board members clamoring for answers he wasn't ready to give. It had been 2 days since Jacob and Lily appeared on his golf course, 2 days since the silver necklace and Emily's note cracked open a door he'd bolted shut. He hadn't sent the children away, not yet. They were still at the Hamptons estate, under the care of his housekeeper, Margaret, a stern woman who'd raised no objections when he'd told her to keep them fed and quiet. He hadn't seen them since, hadn't wanted to, but the world had seen them, or at least a blurry photo snapped by some vulture with a camera. The image was everywhere now. 2 small figures standing on his pristine green, dwarfed by his towering silhouette. The caption read, "Who are Grayson's mystery heirs?" Richard's jaw tightened as he turned from the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He'd built his life on control, every deal, every handshake, every dollar accounted for. This wasn't supposed to happen. He'd spent decades crafting an image of invincibility, a man above reproach, and now it was unraveling because of 2 kids and a past he couldn't outrun. The board had called an emergency meeting for that afternoon, their voices already sharp with demands through terse emails. Clarify this, Richard. Deny it. Fix it. He'd fix it all right. He always did. The phone rang again, its shrill tones slicing through the quiet. He picked it up, his voice steady as granite. "Grayson." "Richard, you've seen the news?" Victor Callahan's voice slithered through the line, smooth and mocking, a blade wrapped in velvet. Victor, once his college roommate, now his bitterest rival in the cutthroat world of real estate, never missed a chance to twist the knife. "Quite the scandal you've got brewing. I didn't peg you for the sentimental type, hiding a family all these years." Richard's grip on the receiver tightened, but his tone remained even, betraying nothing. "You're fishing, Victor. There's no story here, just noise." "Noise?" Victor chuckled, low and deliberate. "The press doesn't think so. Neither does the board. I hear they're circling like sharks. And that deal with the Dubai investors? Word is, they're spooked. A man with secrets doesn't inspire confidence, Richard." "Then you've misjudged me," Richard said, his words clipped but calm. "I've got nothing to hide. You, on the other hand, should focus on your own crumbling portfolio. I hear your last project's bleeding cash." Victor's laugh was sharp, unamused. "Keep telling yourself that, but I'll enjoy watching you squirm. You can't bury this one, Grayson. Not like you buried everything else." The line went dead, leaving a silence that pulsed with threat. Richard set the phone down, his movements deliberate, and leaned back in his chair. Victor was a vulture, always had been, circling for weakness. They'd been friends once, partners even, until Richard outmaneuvered him on a deal that launched Grayson Enterprises into the stratosphere. Victor never forgave him, and now he'd found a crack to exploit. But Richard wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. He never did. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not then, not now. The door opened, and his assistant, Claire, stepped in, her tablet clutched like a shield. "Sir, the board's on their way up. They want a statement by noon. And Margaret called from the house. She says the kids are asking for you." Richard's chest tightened, but his face remained a mask. "Tell Margaret to handle it. I'll deal with the board." Claire hesitated, then nodded and slipped out. He turned back to the window, the city a blur beyond the glass. The kids, Jacob and Lily. He'd avoided them since that night in his study, since Jacob's words, "She wore that every day," had lodged in his mind like a splinter. He didn't owe them anything. They weren't his responsibility. Emily had made her choice, and he'd made his. But the image of Lily's hazel eyes, so like her mother's, flickered unbidden, and with it came a memory. Emily at 7, drawing stick figures of their family on a rainy afternoon, her small voice saying, "You're the strongest, Daddy." He shook it off, refocusing as the board filed in, 6 men and women in crisp suits, their expressions a mix of concern and calculation. Chairman Harold Pierce took the lead, his voice gruff. "Richard, we need this contained. The Dubai deals. On the line. Are these kids yours or not?" "They're not," Richard said, his tone firm, unshaken. "A misunderstanding. I'll issue a statement denying it. The press will move on." Harold's eyes narrowed. "And if they don't? If there's proof? We can't afford a scandal. Not now." "There's no proof because there's no truth," Richard replied, meeting each gaze with steady resolve. "I've run this company with integrity for 30 years. You know that." The room murmured, unconvinced but unwilling to push harder. They'd seen him weather storms before, hostile takeovers, market crashes. He'd always come out on top. Harold sighed. "Fine. Draft the denial. But if this blows up, Richard, it's on you." They left and Richard sat alone again, the headlines glaring from his desk. He picked up a paper, scanning the speculation, when a small detail caught his eye. A sidebar about an anonymous donor who'd funded a homeless shelter in Queens years ago. The description matched Emily's old neighborhood. His pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing even. Could it be her? Had she done good with nothing while he'd hoarded everything? The phone rang again. Margaret. He answered, bracing himself. "Sir," she said, her voice clipped. "The little girl's crying. She keeps asking when you're coming back. The boy says they'll leave if you don't want them, but they've got nowhere to go." Richard closed his eyes, the weight of the day pressing down. "Keep them there," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'll handle it." He hung up, staring at the skyline. The world he'd built was closing in. Victor's taunts, the board's demands, the press's hunger. And now, 2 children he didn't know, carrying a legacy he couldn't claim. His honor, his dignity, hung in the balance, tested not by fists or fury, but by the quiet, unrelenting truth seeping through the cracks. The fire in the Hamptons estate's living room crackled softly, its glow dancing across the oak-paneled walls and the crystal chandelier overhead. Richard Grayson sat in a leather armchair, the room's opulence a stark contrast to the turmoil churning inside him. The world outside was closing in, headlines screaming, Victor Callahan circling, the board breathing down his neck. But here, in this quiet corner, he sought refuge. The silver necklace from Emily's box rested on the side table, its tiny star catching the light like a beacon he couldn't ignore. He'd come home from Manhattan late, the weight of the day still heavy on his shoulders, intending to draft a statement that would silence the storm. But Margaret had met him at the door, her face tight with something she wouldn't say, and handed him a small, worn journal. "The boy left this," she'd said. "He insisted you see it." Richard held the journal now, its cover faded too, a dull brown, its edges frayed from years of handling. Emily's journal. The thought alone tightened his chest, but he kept his breathing steady, his hands firm as he opened it. Her handwriting spilled across the pages, slanted, familiar, a ghost of the girl he'd once known. He hadn't wanted to read it, hadn't wanted to face whatever truths lay within, but the pull was too strong. He'd spent 30 years controlling his world, shutting out the past. Now, it demanded to be heard. The first entry was dated 10 years ago, shortly after she'd left. "Dad won't forgive me," she wrote, "but I can't live his life. I chose love and I'll make it work, even if he thinks I've shamed him." Richard's jaw clenched, but he read on, each word a needle threading through the armor he'd built. She wrote of her husband's death, a car accident that left her alone with a newborn Jacob, then of Lily's birth, of scraping by in a cramped Queens apartment with no heat in winter. "I tell the kids their grandfather's a great man," she wrote later, "because I want them to believe in something bigger, even if he doesn't believe in me." He paused, the fire's warmth doing nothing to ease the chill spreading through him. Emily hadn't cursed him, hadn't raged. She'd protected him, preserved his image for her children, while he'd turned his back. The splinter of guilt he'd buried for decades twisted deeper, but he didn't flinch, didn't let it break him. He turned the page. The final entry was dated a year ago, the ink shaky, as if written through pain. "I'm sick," it read. The doctors say it's bad. Cancer moving fast. I don't have long. I keep Dad's necklace close. A piece of him I can still hold. He never came, but I don't hate him. I wish he'd see Jacob and Lily just once. They're strong, like him. I won't ask for his money. I never did. I just hope he finds them someday when I'm gone. They deserve a family. The words trailed off, unfinished, a quiet plea that echoed in the silence. Richard closed the journal, his fingers tracing its worn cover. Emily was dead. He'd known it from Jacob's words, but seeing it in her hand, feeling her voice reach, across the years, made it real. She'd died alone, raising 2 kids with nothing, while he'd sat in boardrooms and sipped champagne at galas. And yet she'd kept his necklace, kept his memory alive for them. The realization hit like a tide, but he didn't let it sweep him away. He sat still, his breathing even, his face a mask of calm. Control was his anchor, and he clung to it now. Footsteps broke the silence, soft, hesitant. Jacob appeared in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the room's grandeur. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Richard's. "You read it," he said, not a question but a statement. His voice steady despite the shadows beneath his gaze. Richard nodded, setting the journal down with deliberate care. "Yes." "She's gone," Jacob said, stepping closer, his sneakers scuffing the hardwood. "She cried sometimes watching you on TV, said you were the strongest man she knew, but you never came. Why?" The question hung between them, raw and piercing. Richard's throat tightened, but he met the boy's stare, his voice low and measured. "I thought she didn't need me. I thought I was doing what was right, for her, for the family name." "She needed you," Jacob said, his tone flat but cutting. "We needed you. She kept that necklace every day, even when we had nothing. She said it was proof you cared once." Richard's hand drifted to the necklace, the star cold against his palm. Proof he cared. He'd sent money, anonymous checks through a lawyer, thinking it absolved him. But Emily hadn't wanted his money. She'd wanted him. And he'd failed her, not out of malice, but out of pride. The weight of that truth pressed down, but he didn't look away, didn't let his composure crack. "I didn't know," he said, the words simple, honest. "I should have." Jacob studied him, then nodded, as if weighing something unseen. "Lily's asleep. She thinks you'll send us away. I told her you might not, but I don't know if I believe it." Richard's chest ached, but he kept his voice steady. "I haven't decided." The boy turned to leave, then paused. "She said you'd be strong enough to fix it. I hope she was right." He walked out, leaving Richard alone with the fire and the journal, the echoes of Emily's words ringing in his ears. He leaned back, the necklace still in his hand, its weight a quiet accusation. The world outside, the press, Victor, the board, raged on. But here, in this moment, it was Emily's voice that cut deepest. She'd died believing in him, preserving his dignity while he'd squandered hers. He'd built an empire on honor, but what was it worth if it left him alone, staring at a legacy of loss? The fire popped, a log crumbling to ash. Richard set the necklace beside the journal, his movements slow, deliberate. He wouldn't break. Not now. Not ever. But for the first time in 30 years, he felt the stirrings of something stronger. Then pride. A duty to the family he'd abandoned. A chance to reclaim the honor he'd misunderstood. The path ahead was uncertain, but he'd face it as he always had. With control. With dignity. And perhaps with a heart he'd forgotten he had. The kitchen of the Hamptons estate glowed with a warmth Richard Grayson hadn't known it could hold. The late afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows, painting the marble counters in hues of gold, a stark contrast to the cold elegance that defined the rest of his world. He stood at the stove, a pristine apron tied over his tailored shirt, stirring a pot of milk with a wooden spoon he'd fumbled to find. The air carried the faint, sweet scent of it warming. A simple task, yet one that felt foreign to hands, more accustomed to signing contracts than tending to domesticity. He'd told Margaret to take the evening off, a decision born less from confidence than from a quiet resolve he couldn't yet name. 3 days had passed since Emily's journal had laid bare the cost of his pride. 3 days since Jacob's words, "She said you'd be strong enough to fix it," had rooted themselves in his mind, refusing to let go. The press had grown louder, Victor Callahan's taunts sharper, the board's impatience more insistent. That morning's headline screamed, "Grayson's silence fuels family scandal speculation." A new rumor, seeded by Victor, claimed Richard was exploiting the children for sympathy to salvage the Dubai deal. It was a lie, vicious and calculated, but it stung all the same. He'd drafted a denial, kept it curt and cold, and sent it to Claire for release. But the words felt hollow, a shield too thin to protect what mattered now. What mattered stood before him. Jacob and Lily, perched at the kitchen island on stools too tall for their small frames. Jacob watched him with those piercing eyes, arms crossed, a silent judge. Lily clutched her ragged doll, her hazel gaze, Emily's gaze, darting between Richard and the pot, a flicker of curiosity softening her usual wariness. He'd decided to keep them here, at least for now. Not out of sentiment, he told himself, but duty. They had nowhere else to go, and he wouldn't be the man who turned them out. Not again. The milk hissed, bubbling over the rim, and Richard cursed under his breath, pulling the pot off the heat. A white puddle spread across the stove, and Jacob snorted, a small, unexpected laugh that broke the tension. "You're worse than Mom," he said, his voice carrying a trace of amusement. "She could make hot chocolate without burning the house down." Richard raised an eyebrow, wiping the spill with a cloth, his movement steady despite the mess. "I'm not burning anything," he said, his tone dry but not harsh. "It's a learning curve. I don't usually do this." Lily tilted her head, her voice soft. "Mom said you were good at everything." The words landed like a stone, but Richard kept his face calm, pouring the salvaged milk into 2 mugs. "She overestimated me," he said, reaching for a canister of cocoa he'd found in the pantry. "I'm better with buildings than kitchens." He stirred in the powder, the clink of the spoon against ceramic the only sound for a moment. Emily's faith in him, written in her journal, echoed by her children, gnawed at him. She'd seen strength where he'd seen only rigidity, a man too proud to bend. He handed the mugs to them, his hands steady, and watched as Lily took a tentative sip, her eyes widening. "It's good," she said, a shy smile breaking through. Jacob took his without a word, blowing on it before drinking. Then he looked up, his gaze direct. "Why'd you keep us here? You said you didn't want us." Richard leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "I said I hadn't decided. Things change. You needed a place to stay, and I have room. That's all." "That's not all," Jacob shot back, his tone sharp but not angry. "You read her book. You know she's gone. You could have sent us away, but you didn't. Why?" The boy's perceptiveness cut deep, but Richard didn't flinch. He met Jacob's stare, his voice low and even. "Because I owed her that much. She was my daughter, and I wasn't there when it mattered. I won't make the same mistake twice." Lily's mug paused halfway to her mouth, her eyes searching his face. "Your mom's dad?" she asked, as if piecing it together for the first time. "She said you were busy, but you'd find us someday." Richard's chest tightened, but he nodded, keeping his composure. "I was busy. Too busy. I'm here. Now." The phone on the counter buzzed. Claire, no doubt, with more bad news. He ignored it, focusing on the children. Jacob set his mug down, his expression softening just a fraction. "She didn't hate you," he said. "Even when we had nothing, she didn't. She said you'd fix it if you knew." The weight of that trust settled over Richard, heavy, but not crushing. He'd failed Emily, but she'd believed in him anyway. He wouldn't fail her children. Not if he could help it. "I didn't know," he said, his voice steady, honest. "But I'm trying to figure it out." Lily slid off her stool, hesitating before stepping closer. She reached out, her small hand brushing his, and then she hugged him, quick, awkward, but real. "I like you," she whispered, her doll pressed between them. "You're nice." Richard froze for a split second, the warmth of her touch piercing through decades of distance. Then he rested a hand on her head, light but present, his voice soft. "Thank you, Lily." Jacob watched, saying nothing, but the hardness in his eyes eased. The phone buzzed again, insistent, and Richard glanced at it, Claire's name flashing. He sighed, stepping back. "I need to take this," he said. "Finish your drinks." He picked up the phone and walked to the edge of the kitchen, keeping his tone clipped. "What is it?" "Sir?" Claire said, her voice tight. "Victor's at it again. He's leaked a story, claims you're staging this for PR. The board's furious. They want you in tomorrow or they'll push for a vote." Richard's grip tightened, but his face remained impassive, his voice cool. "Let them push. I'll be there. Handle the press. Stick to the statement." He hung up, turning back to the children. Lily smiled at him, chocolate smudged on her lip, and Jacob nodded, a silent acknowledgement. The world outside raged, Victor's lies, the board's threats. But here, in this kitchen, something shifted. Richard felt it, a flicker of purpose, a chance to reclaim the honor he'd lost not in boardrooms, but in the quiet moments he'd let slip away. He picked up his own mug, the warmth seeping into his hands. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, and that he realized was a strength he'd never known he needed. Rain lashed the Long Island golf course, turning the emerald green into a shimmering sheet of silver under a bruised sky. Richard Grayson stood at its edge, his tailored coat soaked through, water dripping from the brim of his cap. The wind howled, tugging at him, but he stood firm, a solitary figure against the storm. He'd come here to think, to escape the chaos that had erupted since Victor Callahan's latest strike. The headlines that morning had been merciless. Grayson's PR stunt exposed, children a ploy, rival claims. Victor had twisted the knife deeper, feeding the press a tale of calculated deception, and the board was teetering on the edge of revolt. Richard's denial had held them at bay, but only just. He needed clarity, and the green, his sanctuary, had always given it to him. The crunch of gravel broke through the rain's roar. Richard turned, his eyes narrowing as a figure emerged from the mist. Victor Callahan, impeccable in a trench coat, an umbrella shielding his smug grin. The sight of him ignited a spark in Richard's chest, but he tamped it down, his face a mask of calm. Victor stopped a few feet away, his voice cutting through the wind. "You look like a drowned rat, Grayson. Fitting, considering the mess you're in." Richard's hands clenched in his pockets, but his tone remained steady, cool as the rain. "You've got a lot of nerve showing up here, Victor. What do you want?" Victor tilted his head, his grin widening. "To see you squirm. You've played the noble king too long, untouchable, unflappable. But this?" He gestured broadly as if encompassing the scandal. "This is your undoing. The board's ready to cut you loose, the investors are spooked, and those kids, poor, little pawns, are the perfect excuse." "They're not pawns," Richard said, his voice low, unwavering. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Victor stepped closer, his umbrella casting a shadow over them both. "I know more than you think. I saw her, you know. Emily. A year ago, right before she died. She came to me begging for help. Said she was sick, couldn't afford the bills. She asked me to reach out to you, to tell you her kids needed you." Richard's breath hitched, but he kept his gaze locked on Victor's, his posture rigid. "You're lying." "Am I?" Victor's eyes gleamed, cold and triumphant. She was desperate, Richard. Skin and bones, clutching that damn necklace like it was a lifeline. I told her no. Why should I help the daughter of the man who stabbed me in the back? I wanted you to feel this, to lose everything like I did when you took that deal from me. The words landed like blows, each one a shard of glass piercing Richard's composure. Emily had reached out, not to him, but to Victor, and he'd turned her away. The image of her, frail and pleading, burned in his mind, but he didn't flinch, didn't let the fury rising in him spill over. "You're a coward," he said, his voice steady despite the storm within. "She needed help, and you used her to hurt me." Victor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "And you didn't?" You let her rot out there, too proud to lift a finger. But here's the kicker, Grayson. I've got proof. He pulled a folded letter from his coat, its edges damp but intact. She wrote to you, sent it to your office, begging you to come. Your secretary intercepted it, thought it was junk, filed it away. I found it in your archives when I bought out your old firm's records. You never even saw it. Richard's heart thudded, but he kept his face impassive, his hands still in his pockets. Victor held the letter out, taunting, and Richard took it, unfolding it with deliberate care. Emily's handwriting stared back at him, faint and trembling. Dad, I'm dying. Jacob and Lily need you. Please come. I forgive you. The date was a year ago, the address his old Manhattan office. He'd never known. Never had the chance. The rain soaked the paper, ink bleeding, but Richard's grip remained firm. Victor leaned in, his voice a hiss. You failed her, Grayson. You're no better than me. Run now. Hide like you always do. You're finished. Richard's vision blurred, not from the rain, but from a surge of grief and rage he hadn't felt in decades. He could have lunged, could have struck Victor down and let the storm wash away the evidence. But he didn't. He stood there, the letter crumpling in his hand, and took a slow, deep breath. Control was his strength, his dignity, and he wouldn't surrender it. Not to Victor, not to this. You're wrong, he said, his voice low, resonant. I'm not running. You don't understand honor. You never did. Victor's grin faltered, but before he could retort, two small figures burst from the trees. Jacob and Lily, drenched and breathless, their faces pale with worry. Grandpa! Lily cried, her voice cutting through the wind. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist, her doll dangling soaked in her grip. Jacob followed, grabbing his sleeve. We saw him from the house. Don't fight him, please. Richard's resolve hardened, the children's touch grounding him. He looked down at Lily, then at Jacob, and nodded. I won't, he said, his tone soft but firm. He turned back to Victor, his eyes cold but steady. You've said your piece. Now get off my land. Victor sneered, but the fight had shifted. He backed away, umbrella tilting in the wind. This isn't over, he spat, then disappeared into the rain. Richard stood there, Lily clinging to him, Jacob at his side, the letter a sodden weight in his hand. The storm raged, but he didn't waver. Emily's plea, I forgive you, echoed in his mind, a lifeline he hadn't earned. Victor had tried to break him, to strip his honor with this final blow, but he'd failed. Richard wouldn't crumble, wouldn't lash out. He'd lost Emily to his pride, but these children, these small fierce souls were here, and he'd protect them with every ounce of dignity he had left. Come on, he said, guiding them toward the house. His voice, calm despite the ache in his chest. Let's get out of the rain. As they walked, the letter slipped from his hand, carried off by the wind. A past he couldn't change, but a future he could still fight for. The boardroom of Grayson Enterprises gleamed with cold precision, its long mahogany table reflecting the harsh fluorescent light overhead. Richard Grayson stood at the head, his silver hair catching the glow, his tailored suit impeccable despite the storm he'd weathered the day before. The rain-soaked confrontation with Victor Callahan lingered in his mind. The crumpled letter, Emily's final plea, the children's desperate grip, but he pushed it down, his face a mask of calm resolve. Before him sat the board, 8 men and women in crisp suits, their expressions a mix of skepticism and impatience. The air crackled with tension, the weight of their ultimatum unspoken but palpable. Resolve the scandal or lose everything. Chairman Harold Pierce leaned forward, his voice gruff. We've given you time, Richard. The Dubai deal's hanging by a thread, and Callahan's latest stunt, claiming you staged those kids, has the investors spooked. We need a decision. Deny them publicly, send them away, or we vote you out. Today. Richard's hands rested lightly on the table, his posture steady, unshaken. He'd spent the night sleepless, the children's faces, Jacob's sharp defiance, Lily's fragile trust, etched behind his eyes. Emily's journal lay, open in his memory. I hope he finds them someday. Victor's taunts echoed too. You're finished. But it was the letter lost to the rain that anchored him now. I forgive you. A forgiveness he hadn't earned, a duty he couldn't ignore. He'd built this empire on pride, on a warped sense of honor, but it had cost him his daughter. It wouldn't cost her children too. I've made my decision, he said, his voice low, resonant, cutting through the murmurs. I'm stepping down as CEO effective immediately. I'll sell my controlling shares, 51%, to fund a trust for Jacob and Lily, Emily's children. They're my grandchildren, and I won't deny them. Not for this company, not for anyone. The room erupted. Gasps, protests, Harold slamming a fist on the table. Are you insane, Richard? You're throwing away 30 years, billions, for 2 kids you barely know? Richard met Harold's glare, his gaze unwavering. I know, them enough. I've spent 30 years chasing a legacy that left me alone. This isn't about money, it's about what's right. I failed their mother. I won't fail them. A woman in a pinstripe suit, Eleanor, the CFO, leaned in, her voice sharp. And what about us? The company? Callahan's waiting to pounce. You're handing him the keys. Let him try, Richard said, his tone cool but firm. Grayson Enterprises will survive without me. It always has. But those children won't survive without someone. That's my responsibility now. The board argued, voices rising, but Richard stood silent, his hands clasped behind his back. He'd faced worse, hostile takeovers, market crashes, and emerged, unscathed because he'd never let emotion rule him. This was different. This was surrender, but not defeat. A choice to trade power for purpose, pride for dignity. They could vote him out, strip his title, but they couldn't take the honor he was reclaiming piece by quiet piece. Harold sighed, rubbing his temples. You're sure about this? No going back. I'm sure, Richard said, his voice steady as stone. Draft the papers. I'll sign them by noon. The meeting ended in a haze of disbelief, the board filing out with muttered curses and shaking heads. Richard stayed, staring at the empty room, the weight of his decision settling over him like a mantle. He'd lost the empire he'd built, but the ache in his chest wasn't regret, it was relief. For the first time in decades, he felt unburdened, free to face a truth he'd run from too long. He drove back to the Hamptons that afternoon, the sky clearing to a soft blue, the estate's grandeur fading into the rearview mirror. He'd called ahead, told Margaret to pack light, his things, the children's, and meet him at a small, seaside cottage he'd bought years ago but never used. It was modest, a far cry from the mansion's excess, but it had a porch overlooking the waves, a patch of grass out back. A place to start over. When he arrived, Jacob and Lily were waiting, on the steps, their meager belongings in 2 duffels at their feet. Margaret stood nearby, her stern face softened by something like approval. Lily ran to him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her doll dangling. "Grandpa, you're back," she cried, her voice bright with trust. Richard rested a hand on her head, his touch gentle but sure. "I told you I would be." Jacob approached slower, his eyes searching Richard's face. "Margaret said you're leaving the big house. Why?" Richard knelt to their level, his voice low, steady. "I gave up some things today. Important things, to make sure you're taken care of. You don't need to worry anymore." Jacob's brow furrowed. "You didn't have to. We'd figure it out." "I know you would," Richard said, a faint smile breaking through. "You're strong like your mother, but I wanted to. It's what she'd have wanted too." Lily beamed, hugging him tighter, and Jacob nodded, a flicker of relief in his gaze. "Mom said you'd fix it, she was right." Richard stood guiding them inside. The cottage was simple, wood floors, a small kitchen, a fireplace, but it felt alive with their presence. He unpacked their bags, setting Lily's doll on a shelf, while Jacob explored the porch. Margaret lingered, handing him a mug of coffee. "You're a fool, sir," she said, her tone dry but warm. "A good one." He took the mug, his voice quiet. "Maybe. But it's the first time I've felt like one worth keeping around." That night, He stood on the porch, the sea's rhythm a soothing hum. The trust, named for Emily, would fund the children's future, and he'd pledge the rest to a charity for orphans, a legacy beyond wealth. Victor might crow, the press might spin their tales, but Richard didn't care. He'd lost the trappings of honor, power, prestige, but found its core: responsibility, love, a family he'd almost let slip away. Lily's laughter drifted from inside, Jacob's voice joining in. Richard sipped his coffee, the warmth seeping into his hands. The dawn after sacrifice was brighter than he'd imagined. Not a throne, but a porch. Not a crown, but two small hands reaching for his. And that, he knew, was honor worth fighting for. The sun hung low over the seaside cottage, its golden light spilling across the patchy grass out back, where Richard Grayson knelt with a battered golf club in hand. The air carried the tang of salt and the distant crash of waves, a rhythm that had become his new heartbeat. A week had passed since he'd walked away from Grayson Enterprises, since he'd traded the sterile grandeur of the Hamptons estate for this modest haven. The cottage was small, wood floors scuffed from years of neglect, a kitchen barely big enough for three, but it hummed with life. Jacob and Lily darted around him now, their laughter weaving through the breeze, a sound he'd once thought he'd never hear again. Richard adjusted the club, showing Jacob how to grip it, his voice steady and patient. "Keep your hands firm but not tight. It's about control, not force." The boy nodded, his sharp eyes focused, mimicking Richard's stance. Lily sat cross-legged nearby, her doll propped beside her, clapping as Jacob took a swing. The ball, a scuffed practice one from Richard's old set, rolled a few feet across the grass and she cheered, "You did it." Richard smiled, a rare, unguarded curve of his lips. "Not bad for a first try," he said, ruffling Jacob's hair. The boy ducked away, but a grin tugged at his mouth, a quiet victory in itself. These moments, simple and unscripted, were stitching together the pieces of a life he'd let unravel. He'd spent decades chasing a hollow honor, boardroom triumphs, billion-dollar deals, only to find it here, in the laughter of two children who called him Grandpa. The trust he'd established, the Emily Grayson Foundation, was already taking shape. His shares, sold at a price that stunned even the board, had funded it. A lifeline for Jacob and Lily's future, and a charity to support orphans like them. The news had broken that morning, a quiet announcement buried beneath Victor Callahan's gloating headlines. Grayson falls, Callahan rises. Victor had swooped in, buying up what Richard left behind, crowing about his rival's defeat. The press painted Richard as a broken man, a titan toppled by scandal. He didn't care. Let them spin their tales. The truth lived here, in this cottage, in the grass beneath his feet. He stood, stretching his back, and watched the children chase each other across the yard. Lily tripped, tumbling into the grass with a giggle, and Jacob hauled her up, his small hands steady. They were strong, stronger than he'd been at their age, stronger than he'd given Emily credit for raising them to be. Her journal rested on the porch table now, its pages worn but cherished, a testament to the daughter he'd failed and the mother she'd become. I hope he finds them someday. She'd believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. That belief had guided him here, to this second chance. The screen door creaked, and Margaret stepped out, a tray of lemonade in her hands. She'd insisted on staying, trading the mansion's staff quarters for a room in the cottage, her stern demeanor softened by the children's presence. "You're spoiling them," she said, setting the tray down, but her eyes twinkled with something like pride. "They deserve it," Richard replied, taking a glass. "And I'm learning," she snorted, a rare sound of amusement. "You're a fool, sir, a good one. This suits you better than that glass tower ever did." He sipped the lemonade, the tartness grounding him. She was right. The boardroom had been his battlefield, power his armor, but it had left him empty. Here he was just Richard, Grandpa, a man with a golf club and a promise to keep. He'd lost the trappings of honor, wealth, status, but gained its essence, responsibility, love, a legacy that mattered. Lily ran over, Her face flushed and tugged his sleeve. "Teach me now," she demanded, her hazel eyes, Emily's eyes, bright with excitement. Richard handed his glass to Margaret and knelt again, positioning the club in her small hands. "Like this," he said, guiding her swing. The ball skittered across the grass and she squealed, throwing her arms around his neck. "I did it, Grandpa." "You did," he said, his voice soft, holding her close for a moment longer than he'd planned. Jacob joined them, plopping down, beside Lily, and for a heartbeat they were just three, a family stitched together from broken threads. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Richard sat on the porch steps, a notepad in hand. He wrote a letter, not to the press, not to Victor, but to Emily. "I found them," he penned, his handwriting firm but unhurried. "You were right. They're strong like you. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I'm trying to fix it now to be the man you thought I could be. Thank you for them for this." He folded it, slipped it under a stone by the porch, and let the sea breeze carry his apology to wherever she might hear it. Jacob stepped out, his face serious. "You okay?" he asked, sitting beside him. Richard nodded, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I am. Are you?" "Yeah," Jacob said, then hesitated. "Mom said you'd come. She was right. I'm glad." "Me too," Richard replied, his voice steady, warm. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily joined them, curling against his side, her doll tucked under her arm. "You're the best grandpa," she murmured, her words sleepy but certain. Richard's chest tightened, but he kept his composure, wrapping an arm around her. "I'll try to be," he said, his tone a promise. The stars emerged, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky, and the three of them sat there, the grass beneath them, soft and alive. The world he'd left behind, the towers, the deals, the hollow victories, faded into shadow. Victor might claim the throne. The press might write their epitaphs. But Richard had found something greater, a dignity earned not through power, but through sacrifice, a legacy not of wealth, but of love. He looked at Jacob and Lily, their small forms pressed against him, and felt the weight of 30 years lift. Honor wasn't a crown to wear. It was a hand to hold, a step to take, a life to build. The grass beneath the sun stretched out before him, endless and green, and for the first time, Richard Grayson knew he was home. In the end, it wasn't the towers of wealth or the applause of the elite that defined him. It was the quiet strength of two small hands holding his, the grass beneath their feet, and a legacy rebuilt from the ashes of pride. This isn't just a story of loss and redemption. It's a testament to what truly matters when everything else fades. Love this journey? Smash that like button, subscribe. For more stories that touch the heart, and drop a comment. Tell us what honor means to you.